good afternoon. Let's not waste any time. We have two great books to discuss. Let me introduce first Caroline de Gruyter, author of It Won't Get Better. I don't know the English title. The Hungarian title is Lesz, jobb. Fascinating book about the Austrian monarchy, or better, the Habsburg monarchy, from a Dutch perspective through the eyes of Vienna and the Habsburg family. We'll get back to it. And Milo van Bokkum, sorry, my Dutch is not. Author of Borders and colleague of Caroline at NLC Handelsblad. So you are both journalists, just as I am. I'm Márton Gergely, editor-in-chief of HVG. And welcome to the European capital of border grievances. So you actually can't be in a better country to discuss the Habsburg monarchy and borders, our two main favorite subjects. So it was just in January that I realized that if you want to pay respect to the buried Hungarian kings and queens, you only have 3 places to go. Andrew I lies for 950 years in a tomb of the Tihany monastery, and then a huge gap. Charles the Last, let's say, lies in Funchal, Madeira, and all other Hungarian kings and queens you can still visit lie in the Kapuzinergruft in downtown Vienna, without their names written over them in Hungarian or in Italian or Serbian, Romanian, Greek, Czech, and all the nations they once ruled. So Caroline, who owns the Habsburgs?
Who owns the Habsburgs?
Who owns them? They lie a bit strange in downtown Vienna. Kings of the Czech kingdom, the Hungarian kingdom, of Austria, of South Tyrol, but that is somehow not present on their graves.
I think everybody owns the Habsburgs a little bit. All these kings and the ones who lived and died in succession. And I think this was one of the interesting things about the empire, that it was so multicultural that in the end many people hardly knew where they came from. I was talking to somebody this morning who told me that she had been diving into the origins of her family. This was in Budapest, and her ancestors came from all over the empire, basically, changing their names sometimes as they went to blend in, and that's what everybody did, basically. So I think it's an interesting question. I've tried to describe the Habsburg Empire also in this way because of the Europe we live in today. Actually, it's a book about the European Union, and nobody knows what it is, and nobody knows what it is not, or how it works. So I started describing the Habsburg Empire, and I learned a lot about the European Union, because actually we do the same thing. We have a lot of peoples and nations and language groups, all on a relatively small territory. And to keep the peace, we make compromises, and Fort Voorsprong is, I think, one of the big mottos that the Habsburgs had. And I think the term could have been used by Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the Commission, or now Ursula von der Leyen. That's what they do. And so maybe a little bit from now, nobody will know who owns their graves either.
Yes,
Anyway, my excursion into the Habsburg Empire was triggered by somebody who asked me, do you think the European Union can end up like the Habsburg Empire? and I didn't know the answer. So I started researching. Yeah.
Yes, and you met two Habsburgs who are serving the Orban government right now.
Yeah.
Are they different from the other relatives of the Habsburg family? You have met quite many.
I think what they all have in common is a very strong sense of the family that they belong to. They still have a head of that family, like 600 members. Actually, my book came out during the pandemic, and I was living in Oslo at the time. The Norwegian government had closed the borders, so I couldn't go anywhere. And I actually gave a lecture over Zoom for the Habsburg family, and they were like scattered all over the world. And some, many of them were born outside of what used to be the empire. In America, in Latin America, in Asia, they were all over the place. But it didn't seem to matter much.
Without the war, the Habsburg Reich wouldn't have fallen apart. It's something you write in that book. Do you think that there would be a chance that they are still around, so that this Habsburg Reich could be still around?
I can't answer that question, of course, because this is a what if. But I think the what if questions are always very useful questions. Look, I always learned at school that the Habsburg Empire had perished because of nationalism. And that this was the lesson, the lesson for today's Europe as well. That nationalism can kill the European Union. But as I started my research, I discovered that actually it was not nationalism that had killed the empire. Because when the first war, but it was the war. When the war broke out, there had been nationalists around for decades, and they all wanted more political rights, they wanted more cultural rights, more social rights, and they were getting it, but they were very slow in getting it. But nobody was ever talking about exit, ever. This just didn't enter their minds, and they all had some kind of relationship with the imperial family as well. Even the Hungarians, who were, of course, very uneasy in that empire, but got a lot out of it, they didn't want to leave either, which is an interesting parallel with today, I would say. But what happened when the war broke out? People were lining up in all the corners of the empire. They wanted to teach those nasty Serbs a lesson. And there was no nationalism at all at that time. They were all behind the Kaiser. But what happened, because of the war, first of all the resources went to the front, which was huge, and the war went very badly from day one. So there was no money left. So the emperor, who used to buy off everybody or give this group a bit and then pacify that group, you know how that goes. He couldn't do this anymore. All the political reforms were stopped. In the big cities there was real hunger, in Prague, especially in Vienna. And what happened is that some ethnic groups all of a sudden started accusing one another, exactly what you saw in Sarajevo during the war. That all of a sudden, people who used to mix normally for decades or sometimes centuries, they started accusing each other of, taking the food for themselves and stuff like that. So for many reasons, the state could not cater for the people anymore. So they turned away from the state. There was no added value from it anymore, and they turned towards the nationalists, who were everywhere and had been everywhere for a long time, but had no plan. And then it started with the Czechs. They left without a plan, and then one after another, in the course of a couple of months, everybody left. Of course, the Hungarians were the last to leave, because they were the ones who got most out of the empire, despite all the complaining and the whining all this time. So yeah, and I think we can draw a couple of interesting parallels today's and the role it can play. I'm not going to say that it will go the same way with the European Union, because we're not fighting there and we didn't initiate it. It's a completely different story. But if that war, back to your question, if that war would not have happened, yes, maybe they would have managed, the new emperor, the young Kora, would have managed to turn it around and reform. He had ideas, but he was a weak person, and he was not in the lead of that war. It was the German emperor.
So here we come to borders again. Milo, I remember a clever game from a camp I visited as a former exchange student. Everybody in the camp just spent 1 year in a European country, and then national groups got a blank paper to draw the map of the continent. So the Polish guys who just been all over Europe had to start a blank sheet, draw a map of Europe, and the Spanish and the others. So what happened was, of course, you started with your own country, you knew it best, and then from the Polish map, you didn't see Spain because they didn't have the space left, because they overestimated a bit their country. The Spanish didn't have Finland or the Balkans on their map. The Slovenians didn't have Great Britain on their map. What my Hungarian compatriots have done, I think, was total stupid. They have thrown a historical big Hungary, leaving whole Europe out of that blank sheet. I wanted to ask you first, which border hurts more, the existing ones or those that have vanished?
Which borders?
Hurts more, those that exist or those that vanished?
Well, that's a good question. I think what you see throughout history is that every time. So if we take the Habsburg Empire, for example, there were new borders at the end of the Habsburg Empire, and maybe some groups were happy about this, the Czechs, maybe the Slovaks, but you end up with new groups of people who are unhappy with the new borders, maybe Hungarians in Romania or in Slovakia, and I think this is actually one of the things that I kept running into while writing my book about borders, that there is no ideal border. So the ones that are right now the case, they might be good for some people, but it leaves out other people who might be happier with former borders. So it really depends on whose viewpoint you take. And that's, I think we have as humans this tendency to wanting to draw these lines and trying to have it match with how we sort of feel that is our country. This is very often not possible because people live in, it also reminds what you were saying about Bosnia. It's the same kind of situation, people trying to redraw the map to create a country that they feel is for them good, but for other people not.
You both write about the origin of modern borders. You write that these new borders came after the Westphalia Peace, where there were a lot of fragmented territories in Western Europe, where it was normal that further away there are again few villages which belong to a bishop or a count or whatever. How did it came that borders got so strict?
So for this part of the book, I actually went back to very basic what I learned in my bachelor studies, because I had a really interesting class about Peace of Westphalia and what role it played in the coming of age of the nation state. And basically, the interpretation that I find quite interesting is that during the 30 Years' War, before 1648, before the peace, the Protestant and Catholic rulers were all fighting each other because they had a vision of the continent as being completely Catholic or completely Protestant. So it was like a matter of you either win everything or you lose everything. They wanted to convert the entire continent, and this went on for a really long time. It was very bloody, one of the bloodiest wars, I think, relatively in world history. And at a certain point, after 30 years, they realized, oh, this is not going to work. It's just going to go on forever, and no group can win. So they came up with the idea of, okay, we have a border state, and behind your border you can do your religion, and we can have our religion on our side of the border. And this, it seems quite logical for us now, maybe, but back then it was quite, they had to let go of the idea that the entire continent would be one religion. And this is the birth of the moment that you start to accept, okay, behind the border, maybe it's different, and we leave that to their affairs, and we're not gonna fight with them about their country.
Interesting, because Caroline is writing that for a long time they didn't need a border on the southern realms of the Austrian or Habsburg Empire, because everybody knew where the Turks are and where the Habsburgs are. So what was the rationale to then issue passports to have a border?
Interestingly enough, it was pandemics. It was viruses coming from the Ottoman Empire, and so they wanted to quarantine business people, traders, troubadours, that kind of people, doctors, people moving, who moved freely between the two empires. So they wanted to be quarantined, so they had to put these places for quarantines somewhere, and those somewhere places marked actually the border. And it was a mutual agreement between the Turks, who cooperated well, and the Habsburg Empire. So that's why the fixed borders came into being all through the Balkans.
And how did the borders within the Habsburg Empire emerge? How much was it important? Which part belongs to whom, and what the nationality is having that part of the empire?
Yeah, it was. They had a single market. The empire. They had one currency. I mean, it had a lot of. It was a state, and the EU is not a state, but it had a lot of things in common. And for many people, it didn't really matter what nationality they had. And for others it did, just like today, you have people who move a lot across borders, you have people who don't move at all.
And did the single market help to equalize living conditions within the empire?
Yes, to a large extent it did. But even on the single market, what you had at the time is also what we have now. Is we call it, you have locavores, people who prefer to eat, consume grain that was produced locally and sourced locally. So you had that already back then, and that was a form of nationalism, of course. Even at the time, people described it as a form of mild nationalism.
So Snake Island comes up in your book, but you don't really go into the details of Crimea. Who owns the border? What border is legit? The last one drawn, or the longest existing?
You mean which one has most legitimacy? But you mean with in relation to Crimea, or for the?
Let's start with Crimea.
No, I'm of the very boring viewpoint that it was a territorial violation of Russia, even though for a long cultural history, maybe Crimea was part of the Russian Empire, but it doesn't mean that you can invade and take it over. What I find interesting with regards to your question is that if you look on, depends on, if you open Google Maps in Russia, you will get a different border than if you open it in Western Europe, and they monitor that quite well at Google, so what are the local laws in relation to which borders they have to show. So, but yeah, I'm used to Western European Google Maps, and it's a dotted line, and I think that's...
You write of the fact that Google nearly started a war.
Yeah, yeah. So I find the role of Google Maps quite interesting because it's, I think, in quite a short time, it's really changed our. You know, you used to have to go to your bookshelf and get an atlas and had to look up a certain map, and now it's quite easy to, you know, just type it in your web browser, and it really changed, I think, the way we look at the world. And also, every day, I think I use Street View just to see an address where I need to go. So it has really changed our perception, I think, of the world.
You do that?
I do, yeah.
I never do that.
I do have a lot of colleagues who, when they walk past my desk, they will be like, "How do you get any work done? Because you're only on Google Maps all the time." But that's just my hobby. But yeah, and I think it was between Guatemala and Nicaragua, where there was a border that was drawn by Google, and at a certain point, there was a disagreement between the two countries, and one of them sent a couple of soldiers into territory of the other country. And then the general justified this later, saying that, "Oh, but we were right, just look at Google Maps." So it kind of preempts the justification for the invasion.
Yes, but borders can trick even Holland and Belgium, as I read in the pandemic time, that there's a village where you had a shop running through the border, and then you couldn't buy some item.
It's an interesting case because there's a Zeeman clothing store in the town of Baarle, and it's, I know it's a kind of a low quality, maybe I'm insulting people, but and it's the most famous Zeeman branch, and the entrance is in Belgium, but most of the store is in Holland. You can see that they mark the border on the street, and it goes right through the store. And then in pandemic times, there were different rules for stores in Belgium and the Netherlands. So they closed off half the store, the Belgian part. But I actually think it was a publicity stunt, because I think the rule is where your front door is, that is where, well, there's one house that has the border right through the middle of the front door, so that's a difficult one. But it worked because everyone in Holland read this article, and it became the most famous Zeeman in the country.
I was living, can I add another very nice anecdote? I was living in Oslo during the pandemic, so they closed the borders with Sweden as well. But you had all kinds of, there's high mountains there, so you had ski lifts. People were going up the lift on the Norwegian side, skiing down on the Swedish side, and then they wanted to get back to their cars, and all of a sudden the border was closed. They couldn't get back. Little story.
But at the same time, it is interesting in your book, Milo, that a lot of borders are now funny or a reason for tourism, because it runs on a rail track which still belongs to Belgium, but both sides are Germany, and to know the fighting which goes on in Crimea or in Luhansk and Donetsk and in Karabakh and in other places where territories are similarly disputed over hundreds of years, but people are still fighting each other and not taking a bike trip over the railroad.
Yeah, this is a really good point, and actually I struggled with this a little bit as well during writing, because the original idea was to make a book with interesting or funny border anecdotes, but already quite quickly you stumble upon the problem that very often it's not funny, it's quite serious, and it leads to a lot of pain and fighting, and this is what I tried to address a little bit in the foreword, where I mentioned that we need to stay aware that even when a border is funny, or you can go there and enjoy it, that it's very often has had very serious histories, or it still stands for a kind of separation between countries, even when it's funny, or a separation between peoples. So I think it's important, if you enjoy the funny bike path between Germany and Belgium, I hope that, because the history is also in there, that people maybe, they also realize that they should be happy that now they can sort of enjoy it as being an interesting place, but it wasn't always like that.
Yes, the borders are coming and going, you are writing, and perhaps in the monarchy they also laughed about where the Turkish Habsburg line used to be, and good walks were
The
done.
borders moved in those days. They moved with mutual agreement. So before they were fixed, and before you had the quarantine stations, sometimes they would be a little bit more to this side, and sometimes they were a little bit more to the other side.
You write that the monarchy and the EU are both peace projects, actually. The war is not existent in your book, you finished it before. How shocked were you that on the border of Europe there's a war?
Well, I had lived in Vienna for a couple of years, where Russia had completely obstructed everything that, for instance, the OSCE was doing, but everything with lies and with propaganda and obstruction. So I was relatively closer to the what is now the war theater than I would have been if I had lived in Brussels at that time. So, and from Vienna, the border with Ukraine is closer than the border with Switzerland. Mm-hmm. Let that sink in.
Yes, I have written
Vienna
that
is
down.
full of Hungarians, of Ukrainians, of people from the entire region, like it was during the Empire days, imperial days, but also from Eastern Europe. And I had neighbors, people in my street from Ukraine. So you could see that every time that the political tension was growing between East and West, more people would come to live in Vienna. So, you could hear the cannons almost rumbling a little bit. I wouldn't say I had expected a full-fledged war, almost nobody did, but I was not that surprised either.
Yes, the book is fascinating from that point of view, because you have neighbors saying that they fear an actual attack of Russians on Austria, which still seems far-fetched. And
well, the Austrians are still, if Austria, or part of Austria that was administered by the Soviet Union after the Second World War. You had the Russian part, you had the French, the German and the American part. The Russians stayed there for 10 years. And then they withdrew. The Red Army left on the condition that Austria would always remain neutral. So no NATO, no European integration, European community as it was called. And so they never dared, because they were always afraid the Russians would come back. I mean, we all know that in most other places in Central Europe, the Red Army never left, they stayed. So they had reason to fear that. And some of the older people, I don't think the young have this anymore so strongly, but some of the older people in Austria that I met with very complicated family histories too, because of all these wars and people being moved and borders being moved. They always made sure they had, a tank, a gasoline tank in the car, half full, just in case the Russians would come back. It's a bit pathetic, but people were telling me that.
we have to talk about Hungary. I know it is simplified, but it seems in your book that Hungarians are always the problem.
The Hungarians had a very particular status in the Habsburg Empire, which is very well known, and they used every trick in the book to get most. Everybody was always. This is I think one of the biggest parallels with the EU today. All the communities, the nations, and the language groups, they were permanently unhappy because they always wanted more. They wanted more rights, they wanted more money, they wanted more prominence, everything. But the Hungarians were a little bit more clever and sometimes shrewd in getting that than the other groups. And I think this is one of the parallels with today's Europe. And for me, it was quite a discovery to read about how the Hungarians behaved in the imperial days. And then I moved from Vienna to Oslo, I started working on the book, and then I met the Hungarian ambassador.
That's the most terrible part of the book.
Well, many people tell me that this is for them the most instructive part of the book. You know, my book is also translated into French, and many of the French, they can't stop talking about the interview with this Hungarian ambassador in Oslo. So she hears, so first of all, it's nice because I met her at the reception, and this was the Hungarian National Day. And so she pinned a little Hungarian flag. It was in the former Bourse in Oslo. And she pinned the Hungarian flag on everybody's coat, everybody entering. And there was the Austrian ambassador. And so before he knew it, she had pinned a Hungarian flag on his jacket. And she says, "Finally, I got you there." So everybody was laughing, of course. And then he said, we were talking, and she heard about the book, and then she said, you come and interview me about Europe and the Habsburg Empire. So I went, and she cooked me a complete Habsburg lunch. We were with heavy Tokaj wines and apfelstrudel for dessert, and God knows dessert wines, and it was. She yelled, she cried, she laughed, and she told me in like 2.5, 3 hours, she explained to me, yes, we are like this. We can't stand these big groupings because we always feel like we are the victims and we never get enough. But you know, it is our temperament, partly. It is our temperament. We are like these little dogs on short legs.
Dodgeball, yeah.
Yeah. And they have too much temperament for their little bodies. So it's not me saying it. She herself is drawing all the comparisons. And I taped the entire conversation. I mean, it was quite something.
You haven't fact-checked
I learned
it.
a lot from her.
It really is funny because you let her talk, and in Hungarian we would know other facts that she is not presenting to you, and I'm pretty sure that it's not out of it is clever that you are not constantly reminding the readers about the facts, but letting her do the complaining.
Yeah, and there's two. Look, I'm an outsider looking in, and the book is not about Hungary, of course. Of course, in Hungary, people focus more on the Hungarian parts of the book. Like my book came out in Austria, the only thing they can talk about is Franz Josef and Sissi and so on. But the book is about today's Europe, and I'm just trying to explain how it works and how difficult it is to make it work, so that all the components are not getting at each other's throats. And one of the components is Hungary, the other component is Austria. They can be pretty difficult sometimes too. And like every nation and every language group, except perhaps Belgium and Luxembourg, they will one day turn off the light, I think. The rest just thinks of themselves. Look at the migration issue nowadays. You know, they almost had a deal after a couple of years of negotiating, and then the ones who proposed who made the proposal, Italy, just this morning, just withdrew it. When everybody almost agrees, you can start all over again. You know? And this was the case in the Habsburg Empire, and it is the case in today's Europe. And Hungary is a rather vocal, noticeable part in that story. Second, I wrote the book in 2019, 2020. Since then, a lot of water has flown under the bridge, a lot of Hungarian water as well. So that's also, I mean, I was there to learn from her. I wanted to learn from her. I wanted her to say these things. She had clearly thought about the comparison between today's Europe and the Habsburg Empire, and I just let her go.
As I said, she's now in Georgia.
Yes.
She's stationed there. Milo, I don't know how much you know that Hungarians have a special relationship with the borders in a way that a lot of Hungarians do have stickers or other artifacts with the former Hungarian kingdom's border on it. And even Prime Minister Viktor Orbán had a scarf showing the border, which actually is containing parts of nowadays Ukraine. What do you think about this type of clothing?
I think I know the shape that you mean, and when I was, I think 10 years ago or something, when I saw it for the first time, I didn't know what it was. I don't know where I saw it, but and I thought, what's this thing that it looks a little bit like a fish? You know, it's. It took me a long time to realize that it was the shape of the former country.
It's the shape of a Wiener Schnitzel.
That's also. But I think you see this in a lot of countries that's sort of used to have a larger shape. That it's quite difficult to say goodbye to that. But I think, of course, the biggest challenge is just trying to make sure that the people the Hungarian minorities in the other countries, that they feel at home there, that we try to, everyone tries to live with that situation. What I do find interesting is that, from my sort of border perspective point of view, is that most borders in the world sort of end up settling on mountain ranges, because mountain ranges are very relatively stable borders, because they very often already separate language groups, for example, because people settle on one side of a mountain range, and it's quite difficult to settle on both sides. And of course, the former border of Hungary was on the Carpathian Mountains, which is now in Romania. And then this is a very rare example of a border coming off the mountain, if you know what I mean. So during the course of history, the border, and now Romania is one of the few countries in the world that has a really big mountain range in the middle of the country. And this is interesting, that the Romanians somehow, as a people, they spread out on both sides of the Carpathian Mountains. But yeah, it's this shape. It's even in the Netherlands. There's sometimes people know about the Trianon Treaty and how sensitive it is. But yeah, I don't think it's. Talking about this doesn't, or wishing for this doesn't bring us anywhere.
Yeah, it is interesting to read that the mountains are actually a better border as big rivers. We have the Danube. The Romans only did invade to the Danube, and now there's Liberland, a Danube bank between Croatia and Serbia.
Yeah, so I write quite a lot about natural borders, so to say, and it's very tempting to use nature as sort of a basis for a border, because with a river or with a mountain range, sort of the line is already there. So people are very often tempted to use a river or mountains as a border, and it works quite well for mountains, but with rivers it's different, because they tend to change their flow. This leads to conflicts very often, and people are sort of seduced to use a river as a border because they think it's a good idea, but it's actually not a really good idea. And the Danube between Croatia and Belgrade, it has changed its course, and it has led to between Croatia and Serbia, and it has led to a border dispute between the two countries. And the interesting thing is that there is one part that both countries don't claim, because they both think that the different flows are, and this is very interesting because this is quite rare on the world map, of course, because we are so used to claims overlapping that we kind of forget that maybe sometimes countries also don't claim some. There's also a part of the Sahara between Egypt and Sudan that neither of them claims, but no one lives there. So, but this swamp in the Danube, some Czech politician, he tried to start his own country there. And this is very difficult for Croatia and Serbia because they don't like it, but they can't really, they can't interfere because it undermines their claim for the rest of the flow.
And it's fantastically historical because the Croatians want to follow the old Danube because it shows that they've been there before the Serbs, and the Serbs want to follow the new Danube to show that the Croatians weren't.
Yes, I think it's the Croatians, they want to use the border from Habsburg times, and the Serbians want to use the border from Yugoslav times.
Anything but Habsburg.
And such a small, wonderful story in your book, Caroline, is the letter U, that Franz Josef wants to call himself and his empire Kaiserlich Königlich, so of the emperor king, showing that that's the same, two adjectives combined, and the Hungarians wanted to be Kaiserlich und Königlich, to show that it's that and that, separate, and they win.
And they win because they won many of those battles, of course. I mean, they dragged on for, I can't remember, 10 years or 15 years, and then it was just Ka und Ka. But sometimes you still see Ka.
Might it be that what you said, that the monarchy wasn't ending on the minorities wanting too much, only being true outside of the Hungarian kingdom, and that the Hungarian kingdom somehow suffered from the short mindedness of the Hungarian political elite, which started after 1867, forcefully Hungarianize a country which wasn't that much Hungarian.
You mean what they did with their half of the empire?
Yes.
Well, it was an interesting story, and it's very well documented in many history books about the last decades of the Habsburg Empire. There was like 40% Hungarian speakers in that half of the territory, and from one day to the next, they all had to speak Hungarian. It's like as if the Hungarians were afraid that they would be outnumbered. So everything was heavily on the Austrian side of the Ka und Ka, or the KK, whatever. On the Austrian side, there was multilingualism. There was, bending over backwards to give everybody a little bit more space, although it was never enough. On the Hungarian side, everything was very rapidly centralized and Magyarized, as they called it. Yeah. So that's also why some, when you meet a Romanian who's from a family, parts of Romania were never in today's Romania were never in the Habsburg Empire, but if they come from a part that did belong to the Habsburg Empire, they have negative stories always.
Yes, and I don't know if you know that there's this new huge Trianon memorial place in front of the Hungarian Parliament. You have all the municipalities written in the Hungarian names which were mentioned in the 1913 census, the last census of the Hungarian kingdom. And colleagues from Válasz Online have shown that there are many municipalities on the whole written in Hungarian names which never had Hungarian names, which were forcefully Magyarized, and now they are eternalized as part of the Hungarian kingdom on that wall. Alright, so
History.
Milo, your book ends in a plea to try to share responsibility over contested territories. It is very optimistic or idealistic, so please share your thought.
Well, so first of all, that part was written before Russia invaded Ukraine, so I became more pessimistic about that.
Well, it's about Jerusalem, and you can't be that much optimistic.
Well, so in a certain sense, it's not. I don't have the pretension that many border conflicts can be solved by shared responsibility solutions, but I did find it interesting that during history you run into these examples more often than you think. It used to be quite normal for states to have what is called condominia, like so shared areas, and there are still a couple of them left in the world. It's very small, it's very insignificant. For example, in Spain and France actually share a little island which belongs to both countries at the same time, and this is also. There was a really long time that there was a colony of France and England, or the United Kingdom, with the current country of Vanuatu in Oceania. It was, for a really long time, it was a colony of both countries at the same time. So there were two government buildings. When you would fly into Vanuatu, there were two customs. You could choose sort of which custom regime you could enter the country. There were different stores with different opening times for French and English stores, and I thought that was quite. And then there are even some people. It's not only me, but there were different scholars who have proposed solutions like this for Jerusalem as a city to make it sort of a shared responsibility. Now that was also, of course, in better times because I don't see that happening anytime soon, but. So this is not a solution for everything, but the fact that this exists and has happened is already an interesting sort of, we should think about this and at least realize that the borders don't always have to be as absolute as we have them in our heads. It has been different in some small examples.
Karen, what have you learned about the European Union through the Habsburg monarchy? Did you got more fond of it?
No, yeah. I think what I've learned is that we always expect too much. So people are always dreaming of more federal Europe, more perfect, the famous European dream. Others are dreaming about more power for the nation states again, so less Europe. So everybody's constantly dreaming. But what you see happening is, those dreams never come true, and Europe is a compromise of a compromise per definition, because all the constituent parts need to have a voice in what's happening. It's the member states who have all the power in Brussels, and it's good to realize that. And so the only decisions they can take are compromises. There will be never winners. There will never be losers again. That's during wars, and we decided never again. So everything's a compromise of a compromise, and this is how it goes in a multinational empire. Let's call it an empire, a benign empire that doesn't conquer land, but still it's some kind of an empire. So I think we should stop dreaming and look a little bit more at what kind of a beast it is. In my country, there are very few schools to this day where you can learn how a European law is made, learn how a Dutch law is made. But a lot of, we pull a lot of sovereignty. We also get a lot of sovereignty back from being all together, because we can make one fist on trade and agriculture, for instance. But the price we pay for all of this is that you never get everything you want. And as long as we accept that, we also learn a little bit to stop expecting too much.
But at the same time, you're right, you shouldn't underestimate the strengths of Europe.
I think Europe is much stronger, but this comes also with getting to know what it is and what it isn't. In some respects, I think the EU is very strong.
It forces regulations onto Norway, where you are now living without
No, I'm living
entering.
in Brussels again.
Again, oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, but it helps to live in a country that is in Europe, but not in the European Union. And then you see they copy almost everything that happens in Brussels. They don't say it so much. Switzerland does the same. It's, I would say, 80-90%. And they carve out a few areas in which they can be extremely sovereign, and they tutor about that. So everybody knows, you know, how independent we are. But they're not. And, you know, often, like European defense, for instance, Norway is not in the European Union, doesn't want to become a member, fine. But they were the first to knock on the door when they heard about the plans for to start European defense initiatives a couple of years ago. And they were the first who were ready. So then a European commissioner comes to Norway to celebrate the fact that Norway is the first country to be, you know, ready to move to the next phase. Why does Norway do this? Because to be a small country outside a big bloc, which has, you know, which everybody's always whining and complaining about, perhaps rightly so often, but it gives you protection in this world. And when you're a small one outside, then you're vulnerable for outside powers, which are probably even nastier. So you see that Norway and also Switzerland, they, and now the UK as well, slowly, when this Brexit fever starts eroding a little bit, they're slowly realigning with the European Union. And but most of all, what I saw, I covered the banking crisis and the euro crisis from from the kitchen in Brussels, let's say, is that every time when you read these headlines in the Financial Times, like, is the European Union going to survive this existential crisis? Will it still exist tomorrow? When the leaders are in Brussels and the stakes are so high and they look down the precipice and they see how deep it is, they go back to the negotiating table and compromise a little bit more. They all hate it. And nobody wants to go home and explain, you know, what they gave away, only what they got. But they do it because they don't want this to be destroyed. So the political motivation of, and again, it's the member states who decide these things. It's not anonymous Brussels, like sometimes you see in the Hungarian press as well. Brussels this, Brussels that. Brussels is us, and more even than before. It's the ministers and the heads of state and government who go to Brussels, take the important decisions. Why do they do that? Because they want to. And this is part of the story that people hardly realize. And this is what makes it strong.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's see whether there are any questions. We are running out of our time. Is there any questions? There, sorry. All right. I heard that Viktor Orbán was saying that he wishes for another 1.5 decades to run Hungary to achieve what was done after 1867 within the monarchy. So
did he say that?
Yes.
I'm not surprised.
he did quote that huge success Hungary had within the monarchy. Perhaps that's
yes.
That's some point for optimism. Please.
Optimism from who?
I mean that he sees that in international cooperation there is something for Hungary to win.
You know, for Hungary, I think Hungary can be extremely difficult on a couple of issues, not on all, because mostly they just work fine in Brussels, just like Poland, that likes to be difficult too. The fact that Hungary, which is a small country, I can say this because I'm from another small one, if Hungary would be outside the EU, you know, when it has all on paper, all the theory, all the sovereignty at once, it could never be so difficult. It could never poke up the middle finger to France, or to Germany, or to Brussels, to Sweden. Linking NATO and the EU, it is the fact that they are inside that enables them to be so difficult, you know. So he's playing on this
game.
No, I was just wondering if he also means the borders from 1867, because that would not be a very good situation.
He might mean that as well. Alright, if there's no other questions, I'm happy that you all came, and thanks for the conversation.